I'm Dr. Kris Hart. I work for the University of Birmingham. I was originally a soil biogeochemist, but my role at the University of Birmingham is the Operations Manager for the Birmingham Institute of Forest Research FACE facility. It's a forest FACE experiment, which is free air carbon enrichment in an oak woodland setting. My role there is to facilitate research and provide a research woodland that is essentially in the future. FACE experiments have been done for at least 30 years, but around 20 years ago it was scaled up at Bangor University in an attempt to see how plantation-style trees were going to respond. They did fantastic work there, but unfortunately the results, it was very difficult to determine the results there. But they pioneered it in the UK, and then the Americans under Brookhaven National Laboratories under the Department of Energy, they said, right, we'll give this a shot. And they again, in a plantation-style woodland, they built a facility and they grew the woodland around it. And they looked directly at the trees from a commercial point of view. They worked to the same targets as us. Always this 150 parts per million increase 50 years from now. So they pioneered it, they demonstrated the technology can work, and you can build a facility like this to that scale. Because that's the problem with trees. They're very difficult to study because of their size. So they demonstrated the technology, and then they kind of proved what they needed to prove. And then at least 10 years have gone by, and we've realized now it's more than just the trees. It's a whole ecosystem that's dependent on the trees, or all the trees are just part of. So there is a facility that was built around 5 years ago in Australia, centered around eucalyptus trees, but it's a whole ecosystem experiment that looks at atmosphere, tree physiology, tree pathology, understory plants, soils, entomology, insects, mycology, every level you could think of. And we are now matching that experiment at every level, so we measure all the same things. And so there's only one on each hemisphere at the moment. So it's a new institute, so we are technically only 3 years old, and we've only been running the experiment for 2. Any research project, especially in the environmental setting, needs a few years to gather your database. So we're in the process of building our data set, which can be mined, for a long time to come. But eventually that information will be disseminated through the natural scientific research channels, papers, conferences like this, but ultimately it needs to be fed up to government, to policy level. Our ecosystem has developed over millions of years, which I'm sure this learned audience would understand. But the human influence is very, very dramatic. So for thousands of years, the CO2 levels were much higher than they are today. But that has gradually stepped down to a very, very low level where we've had ice ages, etc., because there's very little CO2 in the atmosphere. So essentially our tree stock are starved of this gas, and they're all fighting for it. It's been running at around 280 parts per million for thousands of years. And then human beings have come along, and we've discovered fossil fuels as a fantastic source of energy for us to develop our civilization, which is what we've effectively done, is injected what was millions of years of carbon deposition as all that CO2 was being scrubbed out the atmosphere by the green infrastructure. So they've locked it all away. We found it, burned it, and we've sent it straight back into the atmosphere. So we've gone from this very stable, in our lifetime scale of hundreds of thousands of years, of around 280 parts per million, up to 400 overnight, essentially. So how is our ecosystem now, and this applies just as much to urban trees as it does to forestry trees and whatever their settings, how are they going to respond to this sudden step change, not a gradual change in how they express their genes or where they set seed or whatever. So no one knows. We can just try and guess. And our experiment is just trying to put some empirical data to back up those guesses. It looks like a bunch of Meccano in the woods, and that's my most simplistic way of putting it. So we have areas of woodlands reserved to act as the background. So scientists can go in and do their measurements to measure trees doing what trees do. Well, in fact, the whole ecosystem is what we're essentially interested in, with oak trees being the primary driver. But then we create the atmospheric conditions that we expect to have in around 50 years from now. So we elevate the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's the only change that we're actually physically making in the woodland. And we do those same measurements in those research patches. And then you can compare the two to what trees are doing now, to what we expect them to do. We've known for a very, very long time that if you add CO2 into the atmosphere in a greenhouse, your tomatoes grow faster and stronger and redder. So we know that this has a fertilizing effect. But because a greenhouse is almost like a laboratory experiment where you're controlling all the variables, what we don't understand is what the natural world and all its weird aberrations of drought, insect attack, and so on, or flooding or whatever, fire. We don't understand how the whole ecosystem is going to respond. So we've designed a facility that is free for the birds and the bees to fly in and out, drought to occur. You know, we don't water the trees when they're dying. We just measure their response to the environment. CO2 is introduced not as a greenhouse, but as a set, what we call arrays. So they are rings of towers that allow the wind and everything to pass through, and we use vertical pipes to push the CO2, and use the wind essentially. We release the CO2 enriched air out of the pipe vertically until it's above the treetops as well. And that's a really, really important point to make, is that we're introducing it from ground level all the way through the tree canopy and above. So the top of the trees, which get all the light and do a lot of the photosynthesis, they are drawing CO2 enriched air down. So there's basically a cushion of air across the research plot. And then we allow that CO2 enriched air to just fly away, well, blow away. Hence the fact that it's a very expensive experiment to run and why they're not all around the world and being done in every forest setting. We buy our CO2, which is a byproduct of ammonia fertilizer production from the back of the agricultural industry. The CO2 that we purchased was going into the atmosphere 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, which I've been to the facility and seen it for myself. And this particular organisation, they allow another company, which I won't mention their name, but to bolt on a carbon capture facility. So they capture this pure gas stream of pure CO2 going into the atmosphere and blowing all over, you know, the northern hemisphere. And they capture about a third, and they sell it to the likes of us and soft drink suppliers, bakeries, nuclear power stations, who use CO2 as an industrial gas. So we buy it, same as any of these other normal suppliers. And every time you open a can of pop, you know, those bubbles that blow off, pretty much a much smaller scale, but the same thing what we're doing. We are pumping this waste gas, waste byproduct, into the forest. We like this to purchase from them because it's in a pure form. There's very little pollutant, so we're not adding nitrogen deposition or sulfur into our woodland as well. So it's just pure CO2 mixed with the air. And yes, it just blows away the same as if it came out of that vent stack. Hopefully, some of our CO2 that we're using is being incorporated into the woodland. And the important thing is that we can measure that CO2 that would have just gone off into the atmosphere at the source. We're passing it through our woodland, some of it's being captured, and because, and this is key, because that CO2 that we purchase comes from a fossil fuel source, it has a very, very specific signature or fingerprint. It's called an isotopic signature, which I won't bore you with. But we can then measure the CO2 that's being pumped out of our vent stack, going into a leaf, going down the tree into the root system, and either being eaten and incorporated into the soil by the fungal community or the mesofauna or whatever, or coming back out of the soil as respiration. We could even compartmentalize that respiration source to know whether it's coming from the roots or from the fungal system or just coming out of the soil. So we can, essentially close our carbon loop from the gas that we bought from that byproduct, that waste gas. We can make use of it. And the isotopic signature, I just point out, is actually different to the contemporary signature. So the natural CO2 that's coming out of the tree or the soil that was incorporated 100 years ago has a different fingerprint, different isotopic signature. So we can just tell the difference. So we know what our CO2 is doing and where it's going. And admittedly, most of it's blowing off. But crucially, the trees and the brambles and everything that's living in that research plot is always exposed to that elevated level of carbon dioxide, which is always 150 parts per million above whatever the normal ambient conditions are. If there's action we need to take, that's what this facility is going to hopefully help, not just the UK, but all of the Northern Hemisphere, really, you know, as we extrapolate from our woodland. And funding is key to this. It's going to take it from being a 10-year project that the University of Birmingham is underpinning to kickstart it, to a much longer term 25 to 50-year project, and always looking into the future. And we're already into our third, nearly fourth year of the funding, and that's been underpinned by the University of Birmingham. So currently we have had no significant research funding from the normal routes, the research councils. We actually had a philanthropic donation, a sort of a significant amount of money. I'm just going to say greater than £10 million and less than 15, in order to build the facility. Because it's a huge gamble to build something like this, and you can't get it to work. The CO2 is going everywhere or whatever, or the trees all just die because you've built all this infrastructure in there. So we've built the facility off the back of this money, which was an amazing gift from essentially two people, a husband and wife, who just care about the environment and recognise that in the UK at least, we lack the knowledge base now and the skills to test these hypotheses. We don't have the investment in forests and tree, arboriculture. Yeah, we don't have that backing from a national basis. So in order to kickstart this, that's why they've created at my institute, it needs the blindfolded support of the research councils, the government and professional bodies and charities. They need to just say, look, here's money, go and do some research. But it's for the benefit of everybody, not just the UK. It's us doing this experiment benefits the Australians and the Chinese and the Americans, because we're building a global data set. BIFoR has a much bigger remit than just a face facility that I work at. And anyone can contact me or my colleagues directly at BIFoR. Just look us up on the internet and you'll find us. Where we cover the urban setting and the not just the ecological side of it, but also the well-being side or the social amenity value. So hopefully we can help the entire research and professional community over the next 10 years. And really what we really need to do is make this experiment as long as possible. So that 400 part million target that I talked about, we're trying to change it again by adding 150 parts per million to our local atmosphere in our experiment to see what it is in 50 years from now. And every year, our CO2 levels increase. Whether we like it or not, even if we all stopped producing CO2 now as a byproduct, the levels are still going to continue to increase over the next 200 years in our atmosphere. The die is cast, as they say. So every year, continuously we measure the CO2, and as that level increases year on year, our target also increases. So we're always looking 50 years into the future. So hopefully always informing policy on what we should be doing next. What pests and diseases are coming, or how will these perceived pests and diseases actually cope in the future? Will they become more vigorous and more diverse or less? Or will the system bounce back?